Welcome to Skip the Queue, a podcast for people working in or working with visitor attractions. I'm your host, Kelly Molson. Each episode, I speak with industry experts from the attractions world. In today's episode, I speak with Jon Young, Director at BVA BDRC, an award-winning international consumer insight consultancy. We discuss their exciting new research around pre-booking and what the drawbacks to this are in the eyes of the visitor. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify and all the usual channels by searching Skip the Queue. Jon, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. It's really lovely to see you again.
Yeah, you too. And I've been listening for quite a while now, so it's an honor to be on here as well. I think it's got a great role to play for the industry, so thank you as well for doing it.
Oh, Jon, thank you. That's super kind of you. Right, don't be too nice to me yet, because you know that we're going to go into our icebreaker questions.
Yeah. I'm a bit worried about.
Don't be worried. I think I've been quite kind to you, Jon. So I want to know, what would you rather give up, your smartphone or your computer?
I would say my smartphone, definitely, because I'm always trying to spend less time on it, and I think that would be a great way of doing that. I have actually read stories of people who've done it, but they've never sort of followed it through. But yeah, so definitely the smartphone.
What do you do to try and reduce your screen time? Do you like lock it in a drawer in the evenings, or?
I've put it into a separate room. I've tried that. What else have I done? You can set your settings so it's grayscale, and apparently that sort of deactivates deactivates the colors in some of your apps, which makes them less appealing. I've actually tried quite a lot and miserably failed. I've read loads of books about it, about that sort of thing, but I'm still sort of scrolling through at 10 at night, and it's next to my bed at night as well, so I failed a bit. So if you could take it away from me, I'm sure my wife would say thank you as well. If you could do that.
Okay, well, I don't know if I can help you with that, because I'm the world's worst. It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think I like to engage with people. I like we speak on Twitter every now and again, and I think that the Twitter platform and LinkedIn for me.
And actually that is something I've done. So I can't access Twitter on my phone now. It's just through my laptop. So that has helped. But
Good.
You end up just wheeling that out then at 9 at night.
I'll just get my laptop out and check Twitter.
Check something. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next one. What was your least favorite food as a child, and do you still hate it, or do you love it now?
Mushrooms. I remember quite clearly when I was about 5 years old, my dad tried to feed me a mushroom. I think he thought that this would be a good way to get me to like them, and I hated them. And he tries to he actually physically put it in my mouth, and I bit his finger. And he didn't talk to me for a while. He had a few stern words. I remember it really clearly. And my wife, she's Polish, and they love going mushroom picking. Whenever we're in Poland, it's like quite a regular pastime. So they go into the woods and they go mushroom picking, and they really, really try to get me to like them. But I just need to sit down, and I think I read that if you eat something 5 times, then you will like it. So maybe I just need to do that, but okay. I still hate it.
So you still hate them? You're still a mushroom hater. I think that's a thing. That's quite common, isn't it? Mushrooms are a bit of a.
I think so.
They're a bit Marmite for people, aren't they?
Yeah, I like Marmite, but mushrooms no, unfortunately. But it's an ambition
to like mushrooms.
Yeah. That's what lockdown does. Is have these weird ambitions.
I love that. It's such a strange goal, Jon. Okay.
Well, I'm full of them.
All right, well, let's go to the unpopular opinion. So tell me something that you believe to be true that hardly anybody agrees with you on.
So I struggle with this. I've sort of oscillated between going really superficial to really deep. So I've ended up with something a little bit superficial. But so my unpopular opinion is that I really don't enjoy Bake Off or Strictly. It's just not for me. And I've tried really hard to like both, but it's a no. I just can't get excited about people baking on TV or dancing. And I like doing both, and I know is a massa double or something like that, the dance and the soggy bottom and all that. I can hold a conversation. It's almost like people who don't like football, but they can kind of hold that kitchen conversation.
Right. You've got the cultural reference down, but
Yeah, absolutely.
you're not down with the shows.
But it's a no, unfortunately.
I'm kind of feeling you on this one, John,
Yeah.
because if it's on, like if Bake Off's on, I'd watch it, but I'm not a massive baker, so I don't have a huge kind of interest in it. And also, I thought I would love Strictly. I used to tap dance when I was a kid. So quite the same, but I was really big into tap dancing, and I thought I'd love it. I just don't love it. I feel like we're taking one for the team there, John, because I've agreed with you on this, and I think we're going to get some Twitter backlash, aren't we?
Pushback, yeah.
It's coming. Sorry, everyone. Well, thank you for that, John.
No worries.
So, John, you are director at the BVA BDRC.
Yes.
It's also a name that I have gotten wrong about 4 billion times on this podcast. So
I know,
something needs to be done about this. But tell us a little bit about what you do.
So with the name, I think that was, it was the brainchild of the founders about 25, maybe 30 years ago now. And they just came up with the name Business Development Research Consultants. And there was just 2 of them. And it got shortened. And now here we are, there's about 100 of us and we're stuck with it. But we got bought by BVA, which didn't help. So that's where that comes from. It wasn't some kind of genius branding idea. Yeah, so as a company, we've got an international presence, so we've got offices around the world. But we are sort of split up into divisions. So we've got 2 divisions in our London office. So we've got the sort of commercial team, and that they work with the banks and media, so ITV, Channel 4, etc. And then we've got our division, which we call On the Move. And the team I work in, we sort of specialise with attractions and tourist boards. So I've been there 11 years now, and throughout that time, I've worked pretty much exclusively with visitor attractions and tourist boards, so the likes of Visit Britain, Visit Wales, Visit Scotland, and a few overseas as well. So we do market research, and we do the whole spectrum really. So it can be anything from focus groups to one-on-one depth interviews to online surveys, and we do audience segmentations, membership work, pricing, pretty much anything that involves, trying to understand what the public think. And yeah, we work with loads and loads of brilliant attractions. It's a wonderful sector to work in, as I'm sure you know, Kelly. So we work with the little museums and some of the large nationals as well. We've got we run the Alva benchmarking survey. So this is a survey that is conducted a few times a year amongst visitors to around 80 different attractions across the UK. And we then sort of benchmark each attraction against the others, just to understand the visitor experience, which marketing they've used, their profile, and then a load of other things as well. So it's quite broad. But yeah, it means we work with lots of great organisations.
It's incredibly useful as well, the data that you provide. And I think one of the ways that we met was through the Visitor Experience Forum.
That's right.
We both spoke on one of their webinars, didn't we?
Yeah.
And I had become aware of what you guys do at the BVA BDRC because of the consumer sentiment tracker that you've been doing all the way through lockdown, which was something that you did off your own back. And tell us a little bit about it, because it was incredibly useful for us as kind of suppliers to the industry, but it must have been a fantastic resource for the sector itself.
Yeah, it was really great. So it was actually the brainchild of my colleague Thomas Folke. I'll give him a name check there, because it was his idea back in, I think, late March. And obviously a lot of our work got cancelled. We work with a lot of hotels as well, so that's in the other team in our division. And so he just felt, it'd be good to have some sort of tracker. And then we all sort of discussed it, and it grew from there. And it was, there's I guess a dual motivation, just like any sort of content marketing. It did obviously paint us in a good light. It was a good way to sort of stay in contact with organizations that we worked with, but also to make new contacts. And I think I spoke on about 10 different webinars in the first 2 months, and one of which I met yourself. So, but it was also really good for us to sort of to help out as well. And most of us in our team, we are regular attractions visitors ourselves, and we've sort of built up relationships with the people we work with as well. So it was nice to be able to provide something for free. And we did that for 23 consecutive weeks. So every week we produced a new report. It kept some of my colleagues busy as well, because I think in the end it was about 70 pages, which is a bit ridiculous by the end of it. But it was full of sort of data to understand how people felt, whether they were open to going out in public, and who was and who wasn't, and loads of other things. And so we stopped that in August, but we've now gone down to conducting the research on a fortnightly basis, and producing a monthly report. And so there should be one actually landing around about now.
Oh, fabulous.
So yeah, it's been a good experience. And when we did stop originally, we had a load of lovely emails from lots of different attractions saying how useful it had been. So yeah, it was worthwhile.
I think that's something that's really come across from great people in the sector throughout this situation that we've been in, is that things that have, like you described it, I mean, ultimately it's a marketing piece, it was a content marketing piece, but it was helpful. And that's what's been really, really important, is that anything that people were pushing out was helpful and useful to the sector. And it was so invaluable, to be able to see this snapshot of how people were feeling. And even for us, we were able to kind of build our own content pieces on your content piece, because we were like, oh, wow, that like this, people have really changed their opinion on how they feel about this thing. Now that's something that affects what we do. Now we can talk about it. And so, thank you for doing it, because I just think it was such a great and useful piece of data to produce. Yeah,
thank you. And I think, I'm not sure if other sectors would have responded so well to it, I think, because one thing that's really striking about the attraction sector is just how much everybody works together. And more often than not, they are actually technically competitors. But they don't see it that way. They think, that as the sum of the parts is greater than the individual. And you see that with Alva. And I think, we've had lots of organizations who we may sort of compete with, also promoting this as well. So yeah, it was great.
Brilliant. Yeah. And sector communication is something that we've been talking about all the way through this. Long may it continue.
Absolutely.
So this brings us to a very recent and new piece of data that you have been working on. And I'm really excited because I have a little copy of it here. And I feel like there's not many people that have got this. So I feel quite special. Now, this is about a topic that we have been talking about this probably since March, but it is still a hot topic and it's on everyone's minds, and it's pre-booking. Now, there is a huge debate at the moment around the benefits of pre-booking versus the more kind of traditional walk-up approach that attractions have taken. And you've carried out a new piece of research which is specifically around this. Just give us an overview of what you've done, of what you've carried out.
Yeah, so actually listening to your podcast and some of the various conversations that that we've sort of been witnessed on various webinars, we felt that there was a lot of debate and a lot of opinion, but that maybe is worth putting some numbers against some of these opinions, just to understand, what was an issue and what wasn't. So we added, I think, around a dozen questions to our our fortnightly tracker that we've just spoken about, amongst a nationally representative sample of the UK population. And we just tried to understand what proportion of these people had pre-booked, what proportion had booked but not shown up. What were the reasons for this? Were they understandable? What proportion had actually booked and didn't fancy a visit, but actually visited because they booked? And then we've also looked at whether people are put off by pre-booking generally, whether people would think it's a good or a bad thing to go to 100% pre-booking after COVID, and what are the reasons that people like it and the reasons people don't like it. So I guess that's it in a nutshell. We've also looked at some of the different audiences and dug into some of our other data as well, just to understand some of the other issues that people are talking about, such as spontaneous visits. So that's it in a nutshell.
Excellent. Let's dive into this
Great.
then, because it's really interesting. And I have to say, I'm a huge advocate for pre-booking, and I know, again, I've said this over and over and over on these podcast interviews, and it's quite surprising. I think I put a post out on a little while ago, asking people what their experiences of it are, and whether they think it's a good thing, whether they think, whether they're uncomfortable with it. And the responses I got were really surprising. I think potentially because I'm very much a planner, and I'm very comfortable to book in advance about what I'm going to do. But obviously there's a percentage of people that are more spontaneous, and they would prefer to just decide what they're going to do on the day, and pre-booking doesn't work for them at all. And it's really fascinating, the data that's come out. So obviously from an attractions perspective, we know what the benefits to the attractions are. We know that pre-booking it allows them to know how many people are coming. It's great from an operational perspective. They know how much of their team they need in. They can even out that kind of pattern of visitor arrivals throughout the day. And we have seen an increase in donations and gift aid contributions as well via pre-booking. But let's start with what the visitors see. Mm-hmm. How supportive are visitors of pre-booking?
So I think it's quite sort of striking that the majority of your sort of market, so these are people who visit attractions, 7 in 10 do think it's a good thing. So 70% stated that they would still go ahead and visit if they found out that the place they had wanted to visit required pre-booking. So that is a strong majority, 70%. We also asked the question in a slightly different way. If post-COVID attractions went to 100% pre-booking, would you see this as a good or a bad thing? And 75% stated either a good thing or it wouldn't make any difference to them. So these are strong majorities who are probably in your camp, Kelly, who are sort of the planners and the organisers, and they're fine with this.
Interesting. But that's not all of them, is it? Okay.
Absolutely.
So what do they, which we'll get to in a little while. And what do they see the main benefits of pre-booking as?
So the main benefit was to be able to plan their time with more certainty. So that was around 3 in 5, so 57% of visitors to indoor attractions, slightly lower for gardens. And just to make the point that we tested pre-booking at indoor attractions, so looking at museums, art galleries, historic houses, and also gardens and country parks, because clearly the weather has a big impact too.
Sure.
And we also tested at restaurants just to kind of get a feel for that sort of benchmark where pre-booking's been in place for quite a long time. So the main reason was just the ability to plan in advance. The second most popular reason was that there's less queuing when we get there. So over half stated that people were allowed to give more than one reason. And then it drops a little bit to around 3 in 10 stating that places just tend to be less busy. 1 in 4 saying we can do some research ahead of the visit. And I think that's quite an important reason, even though only 1 in 4 is giving it. I think for me, one of the benefits of pre-booking to the attraction is they can have this conversation with the visitor in advance of the visit, and you can maybe raise awareness of parts of the attraction that you wouldn't necessarily see. And we've year after year in research we've done with attractions, we speak to big chunks of visitors who say they went for maybe an exhibition, but they had no idea that half of the other elements of a site were there. They didn't know that there was an original version of this document at the back, and they would have loved to have seen it. So I think being able to have that conversation is really important. But for the visitor, that's 1 in 4. And then 1 in 5 stating there are fewer debates about what to do on the day. So I can imagine families, certainly. If it's not spontaneous and it's in the diary a week in advance, then you don't have to have that debate and any sort of toys thrown out of prams.
It's decided in advance. This is what we're doing on Saturday, team. So
Absolutely.
let's plan for it rather than on the day, maybe having to have multiple conversations with different people in your family group about, what does everybody want to do? The decision's already been made. We're doing this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So what about drawbacks? Let's dive into those, because I find these really interesting. So what are the drawbacks in the eyes of the visitor?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, 3 in 10 felt it was actually, they probably think twice and not visit, and 1 in 4 saying it's a bad thing post-COVID. The number one reason that people don't like to book ahead was that they just don't like to commit to things too early. They prefer to be spontaneous, and that was 67% of those who thought it was who thought it was a bad thing. To go to 100% pre-booking. So that's quite a big chunk of people who are quite spontaneous in their behavior. And we had I thought, some quite interesting quotes alongside that. So we asked people to write out, why do you think it's a bad thing? I'll just read a few of those out. I like to be able to make spontaneous decisions in my life. I don't like to be tied to a time. Because I often visit places when I'm passing by. We've noticed in our research that, if it's a city centre attraction, particularly if it's free, you will often have up to, 1 in 5 of your visitors actually deciding to visit when passing. And, I do this quite often myself, where our office is in Holborn in central London. So you would often go for a walk, maybe at lunchtime or after work. And I might sometimes walk past the British Museum and I think, actually, I might just pop in, or any number of others in the area. And when I was working in Birmingham, there's Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, similar sort of thing. You can easily just pop in, and there's a lot of people for whom attractions are just nice places to be, and it's just they might choose it over a cafe or over a park, just because it's a nice place to spend some time. So that was quite interesting. The next couple I thought were also quite interesting. So one person said, if you plan on visiting several places in a day, that means a lot of booking and you have to be hyper organized.
Which again, with a family, that's difficult, right? It's hard enough, to get people out of the house on time to get to the first attraction at the time that you've booked, but then you're constantly clock watching because you think we've got to get to here at this point as well, and things might happen that waylead you.
Paul had actually said he had his own personal experience of going to London during half term and with his son, and then maybe they had a few museums planned, and it was actually quite hard sticking to time. And so I think that's actually one that I hadn't thought of beforehand, because you kind of think in the silo, don't you? Right, I'm pre-booking one place. But the reality is people try to squeeze loads in, especially if they're visiting central London or a big city.
Yeah, completely. And from my personal view, I had kind of not considered how close people might be to attractions and how easy it is just to nip in. You described where your office is in Holborn. We're outside of London, so for me, I'm always kind of making a trip somewhere to go to something. So I've got to get into London first before I go to the museum or go to whatever attraction I've booked to go to. So for me, I'm kind of always doing that plan ahead. There isn't really those opportunities to be spontaneous where I live, so I don't think about being in that zone.
Absolutely, and I think, I know London. I'm from South Wales, but I probably know London in that sense better than anywhere in the UK. But maybe Edinburgh, from when I've been there, is quite similar. But if you imagine, I've been to South Kensington, umpteen times, and often take family there. And I'm thinking to the last time my sister came up, we went to the Natural History Museum, as you do, and then we finished and we had a bit more time. So we said, actually, should we just pop in the Science Museum? So we went there, and I think we even went to the V&A afterwards, just because we were enjoying ourselves so much, but we hadn't planned the other two. It was just Natural History Museum. So I think certainly when they're quite close to each other, that's quite something to bear in mind too. What else was there? So another quite interesting couple of quotes around the spontaneity point. Someone said, when it's about entertainment, it's just stupid to plan your mood.
Okay, yeah.
I quite like that.
Yeah, I get that.
And this sort of, I spoke about 3 months ago. I spoke to somebody. I was doing some work for a museum in central London, and I was trying to understand their sort of habits before lockdown, before COVID, and after lockdown. And the lady I spoke to was an artist, and we did this Zoom chat, and you could see in the background there were some wonderful pieces of art, and it was, she's clearly an incredibly creative person. And she said that before COVID, she was going to attractions maybe 2-3 times a week, if not more. And she just liked being in the National Gallery or the National Portrait Gallery or all these other places. But after lockdown restrictions were lifted, she said she'd been maybe twice in a month, if that. And she had a few reasons, but the main one for her was pre-booking.
Wow.
And she said, I'm such a spontaneous person. I really hate planning. And she even said that when you've got something planned, say at 2:00, then you spend most of the morning kind of thinking about that.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I thought I could actually imagine myself, there's a little anxiety. Am I doing everything to time? And so there's definitely that type of person, and they definitely exist, and they're a minority, but they're a fairly chunky minority. And then there's the not organized people. So it's, someone said it would put me off because I hate organizing. I like to float around and browse. The commitment can be a serious burden, and other events may occur. So maybe a bit extreme, but I think, these people clearly exist, and yeah, I think they're quite valid reasons.
Yeah, completely valid. And this is really difficult, isn't it? Because as an attraction, you need to cater for all of these different types of people, and how everybody needs and wants the flexibility to be able to book or not book. Gosh, it's a really difficult task that people.
It really is, and I think, a couple of people gave the weather as well, which is obviously more applicable for some than others. I think one thing that maybe is missed in the debate, and maybe I've just not heard enough debates in it, but is that a lot of visits to attractions aren't necessarily those tick box, memorable moment, life-changing experiences. I mean, if you're going to Warner Brothers or maybe a Merlin attraction or Natural History Museum for the first time, then obviously it is, these are moments you'll never forget. But a lot of attraction visits are actually really casual visits. We call them the social mindset segment, and they tend to make up around 1 in 5 people who typically visit attractions. And these are people who just go there to be in a nice environment and to maybe chat with a friend or to have a coffee or to just to be around like-minded people. And I guess that can sometimes get missed off. It's not necessarily that big, standout tick box experience every time.
Yeah, like the example that you gave of the artist. Yeah, I'm sure she finds those environments quite inspiring for her work and for what she does, and who she is as a person. To have to plan that is almost like planning your inspiration. It's not quite right, is it? You take yourself off for a walk somewhere random to be inspired, and I think having to kind of go, okay, well at 2:00 I'm going to go to the Tate for my inspiration for the day. It's doesn't quite sit well with her, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a minority, but it feels quite valid.
Are there any differences by visitor party type? So, families, retirees, etc.
Yeah, so it was quite interesting when we asked this question, and when we looked at the life stage. So we looked at pre-nesters, there's under 35s without children in household, older independents, so 35 and over without children in the household, then families, and then retirees. So we look at those 4 different life stages as opposed to age group. And families were a little bit higher in terms of being resistant. I think it is worth noting that they were a little bit higher. It's about 7 percentage points. It's not a huge amount, but the vast majority was still happy with it. And I think my take, having thought about this quite a bit now, is that the differences aren't really based on life stage or party size per se. There are some, and I can understand why families would be resistant. There are more moving parts with a family, literally, and more things that can go wrong in the day. Whereas, if myself and my partner, we've just got ourselves to worry about. So I can see why that would be a barrier. But for me, the biggest distinction is in attitudes. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we do quite a lot of audience segmentations, and we don't tend to do them on demographics anymore. So we don't do it on gender or age. or any other demographic. We do it on people's attitudes, and that's their attitudes to life, or it could be to how they do their leisure behavior or anything else. And that's what's come across here, I think, is that the key distinctions are attitudes to pre-booking and how organized you are and how spontaneous you are and how much you like planning and how much you don't. And that does transcend all life stages. Certainly there's an indication that families are a bit more resistant, but it's not as big as the sort of differences in terms of attitude. One other thing we noticed, though, is that even though families were a bit more resistant, they were actually more likely to go ahead. So it's almost as if they were gritting their teeth and visiting, and again that did make sense, because I guess, you know, when you're a family, you really need to fill your spare time and to get out and do things. So whereas maybe an individual on their own or a couple, there's less pressure to do that.
Yeah, you've got the challenge again of keeping children and, you know, younger members of your family occupied. So that's that. Look, we've got to do something, whether we like this or not. We've got to get them out of the house. We've got to, you know, they've been stuck in these four walls. Everyone's going crazy. We've got to go out and do something, kind of attitude.
Yeah. So my sort of take from this whole section is that not to get too caught up on the party type, and just to think about these different attitudes. Because that feels to be the big dividing point.
Okay. And audiences that are not picked up by the research. So this is, again, I think this was really interesting to me, because I hadn't thought about some of these things as actually being a challenge for people, which is not on, to be honest. I should have been more aware of them. But tell us about the audiences that have not been picked up by the research and how it would affect them.
Yeah, so I think the international audiences. This was amongst a UK sample, so I can visualize here my wife's parents, who are Polish and they don't speak any English, and coming over here, as they have done a few times, and just setting them free into London and see what they get up to. And you know, they often do visit attractions, but they'll walk up and they'll have that conversation, and there's less room for error. But to ask them to go on a website, you know, they don't book their National Express from Stansted. You know, they get my wife to do that because they know that they can do something wrong, and they're a great example in my mind that there's likely to be a barrier for international visitors, particularly those who don't speak English, and there's lots of those who come to London and the rest of the UK. So that's definitely a barrier, I think, and unless you can cover all the bases with language, then I think that will be. I know that Google have an inbuilt translation function, but again, you know, you have to be quite IT savvy to know that. So I think that's definitely one audience. The older retirees, so we conduct our surveys amongst on a panel. So these are people who've signed up to do the surveys online. So we're naturally missing out that small proportion of older citizens who aren't that IT savvy. So I guess my nan would have fallen into that category. She always liked to phone ahead, for example. So there is a danger that you kind of sort of they lose out a little bit. And I think, you know, that obviously there's always the option to phone, and they do that. But perhaps, you know, that is just one extra barrier then, one extra step, when maybe a year before they would have just turned up. So that audience, I think, is quite an important one still, although they are becoming more IT savvy. I think a lot of data shows that. See people's grands on Facebook now to just make that point. That's a different place to 10 years ago, for sure. And I think the third big audience is the low income audiences. And so we've been doing some work for a network of libraries in the UK. And I think it was about 2 months ago that we had a big meeting with representatives of these different libraries around the UK. And we decided to switch our research to online, again, because of COVID. We used to have paper-based surveys that we'd hand out in each library. And we felt it was a great idea, maybe for the same reasons as the pre-booking. You know, it was much more efficient. You know, you get much better data, more reliable, blah, blah, blah. And about halfway through, someone from a Glasgow museum put their hand up and said, this is great, but can we have paper surveys as well? And he said that it was around about 30% of his catchment area didn't have access to the internet.
Right.
And I was really surprised by that.
It's a huge amount.
It is. You don't expect numbers like that. But I know there is quite high sort of deprivation traditionally in that area where the library is. So he said it's absolutely essential that, we have paper surveys, and there's another way of doing this as well. And obviously that made me think about pre-booking online too. And it's been a challenge for certainly the museum sector and the cultural attractions to reach out to all of their audiences. And actually in Glasgow, they've done a really amazing job, the likes of Kelvin Grove, for example. But this audience is quite large, and I guess it needs to be thought about too. So yeah, that's quite a big barrier as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a focus for cultural organisations to raise their awareness in audiences that are not necessarily their natural audiences, or people that are less aware of them, and they would, those people would fit into that category. So it's understanding all the different ways that you need to be able to help people visit, help them understand what you do and be able to book.
Absolutely. I think certain funding, like HLF funding, is dependent on attractions actually doing that as well. So they kind of need to be seen to reach out in all these different ways.
Gosh, so what are the conclusions from this, Jon? Because I don't think it's there's not a one answer fits all, is there? This is going to be a hybrid, some kind of hybrid model.
There really isn't. And I think one thing I didn't mention is the no-shows as well. I don't know if you wanted to mention that, but
yes,
I think there's a sort of a big worry as well that, in our survey, around 10% of people, I think it's 15%, sorry, said that they booked and hadn't shown up. So there's another, I guess, barrier as well. Although we also found that a similar proportion had shown up because they booked. So I think that maybe balances out. So I think in terms of our conclusions, that was quite an important point for me, because there was a lot of people not showing up just because they were never committed in the first place. So I think about 7 in 10 of those people said, actually, it was always 50-50. I just booked it. So I think there is a need to maybe make that more taboo.
There's a challenge there around annual passes as well, isn't there? So people Absolutely. That if you have an annual pass for an for an attraction, and you have to pre-book as well to use that annual pass, you book it, but you might not go. But that can't then be resold. So the attraction, in a way, kind of loses out because they can't. There's no one else that they can put through the door.
Yeah, it is a real challenge. And I think I was really struck by the fact that the majority of people who don't turn up just said they had more than one option that day, and they didn't really get the gravity of it. And I mentioned that we tested restaurants as well. And what was really striking was that the proportion of no-shows was a lot lower, and people who don't turn up to restaurants were more likely to give sort of understandable reasons, like they were ill on the day or so. And I think not turning up to a restaurant is a little bit more taboo. You can kind of visualize in your head that empty table that you're leaving there.
Yeah.
And so I think the more that attractions can create that sense of taboo without sort of shaming anyone, the better. And maybe that'll happen less and less. And I think they are doing that. But you said the annual pass point is quite important. So I think when people have parted with a lot of money for their pre-booking, they're less likely to do it. So yeah, I think one of the conclusions is if we can reduce that a little bit as well, that will help. But in terms of overall conclusions, I think, I'm like yourself. I'm massively in favour of pre-booking. I think it's brilliant at so many different levels, and I think you listed those right at the start. It's great for the attraction, and it can really improve the visitor experience. It can, and also you can gain loyalty and long term, and have that conversation either side. So I'm really behind it. I think it really does suggest though that there's a need for some sort of hybrid where there is a walk-up option possible, because as we've discussed at length, this 1 in 5 of your visitors, they may be spontaneous visitors, depending on where you're situated. Obviously, it does matter where you are and how much you charge. If you are the British Library, then there's loads of people coming out of King's Cross and just popping in. But if you're in the middle of nowhere, then you're less likely to have that. So there's obvious differences, and I guess people need to sort of work those through as well. But yeah, I certainly think some sort of hybrid. And I'm glad I don't have to sort of decide on how that works. And I just get to give the data, because it's clearly very challenging. But there's a lot of operational brains out there, I think, that can really, can work that through. And maybe there's a bit of trial and error as well. But I think the point I made earlier about just understanding it's more of an attitudinal barrier, I think, than anything else. And not to get too bogged down in the demographics of it all, and just to understand that some people hate planning. I'm not so good at it myself, so I can kind of empathize. And I guess just to be aware that there are other audiences out there who might really struggle. And I saw some figures today that from Visit Britain, and their projections on inbound tourism, and it's so low.
16.9 million, wasn't it, for next year?
Oh, well done.
I think that's what I read this morning. I remember looking at it myself, but it's it's so vastly down. It's really scary.
It really is. And there's markets like the States who will take longer to catch up, just because there's a big lag from booking to visiting. So we need to do all we can to get as many of our British based visitors in as possible. So I guess we just need to have all the options we can. That's the key conclusion, I think, really. And like I said, I'll leave it to the boffins and the attractions to work out how to do it, because I guess you don't want to have a situation where, if you can walk up anyway, why would you pre-book?
It's difficult, isn't it? I think it is about balance. I think a lot of attractions are just going to say, no, that's it, we're going to keep the pre-booking, that's it. It's almost tough, but I think it depends on, it's very location driven, like you were saying. It's interesting. We've actually got Jeff Spooner coming on the podcast in the new year from the Warner Brothers studio tour, the making of Harry Potter, which obviously launched with pre-booking from opening day. So it'll be really interesting for people to tune in and hear all of the positives from that. But Jeff is very, pragmatic when he speaks about it, because he does say a lot of those decisions are driven by location, actually, in terms of kind of parking and congestion in the area where they're located as well. It made sense to do that. And so there's so many factors you have to think about, and it is going to be down to the individual attractions to work out what's going to work best for them.
It really is. And I think the likes of Warner Brothers, as I said earlier, they are, when you visit Warner Brothers, it is,
it's magic.
Amazing. I went a few years ago with my niece, and we actually booked 4 months in advance, and it was amazing. And everyone's had the ssame experience, I think. So it is maybe different to the Sir John Soane's in central London, where you can visit more regularly, perhaps. But I think actually one thing that Simon at Roman Baths mentioned was that their booking system is really flexible. So they've had a really low proportion of no-shows. So you can cancel, I think, up to the minute, pretty much. And so I think the more flexibility, the better. And maybe that will help as well. Lots out there, and I'm sure there'll be some great best practice.
Well, lots to think about for 2021. Hopefully this podcast has given you a little insight into what visitors are thinking about pre-booking. Jon, I've been lucky enough to have my copy in advance. Where will people be able to find this research so that they can have a read of it themselves?
So hopefully by the time this is published, we'll have put it into a blog. And maybe in a Q&A format. We'll see how it goes. Might put a few graphs in there. We love a graph.
Love a graph.
Feel a bit naked without a graph, actually, just talking about this. We'll put it on our website, and we'll follow me on LinkedIn or whatever, and I'll be promoting it on there as well.
Great.
on Twitter.
All of our listeners, we will link to all of these things in the show notes. So we'll link to Jon's LinkedIn profile. We'll link to the BVA BDRC website and their Twitter profile. So go ahead and follow them, and then you will have access to this brilliant research. Jon, I always end the podcast by asking our guests to recommend a book. Something that they love or something that's helped shape their career in some way. So have you got something to share with us today?
I do. I've got this book. It's called How Emotions Are Made.
Great.
So I read this on jury service.
Okay. Interesting jury service then.
Yeah, well, when I got to the jury service, I noticed that there were loads and loads of 1,000-piece jigsaws, which gave me an idea that we wouldn't be doing a lot with our time. I think I spent 90% of it just hanging around. So luckily I had this book, which is written by a neurologist called Lisa Feldman Barrett. And it's the science of how emotions are sort of created. It's a hard read, and I don't think I'd have read it if I didn't have so much time on my hands. But it's really, really fascinating, and it kind of changed how I thought about the visitor experience. And basically, it's, in a nutshell, it sort of talks about how you can only really feel emotions if you recognize the stimulus you're given, and if you're not distracted in lots of ways. So when we test the visitor experience now, certainly in exhibitions, we'll just make sure we sort of test how relatable exhibits and descriptions are, and whether there are any distractions in the area in the exhibition room, and lots of other things around that. So I do recommend it. It really changed how we thought about the visitor experience. I'm just looking at the footnotes are about 100 pages, so I'm not sure if anyone will want to win this, but it's really interesting.
Jon, you're not really selling it for our listeners, so I'm not going to lie. But listen, if you've listened to all of that and you'd still like to win that book, then if you head over to our Twitter account and, as ever, retweet this episode announcement with the words "I want Jon's books," then you will be in with a chance of winning a copy of it. Jon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I would like to just thank you again for all of the work that you've been doing throughout lockdown, because it has been invaluable for us, and I know that it's been invaluable for many, many attractions up and down the UK. So thank you.
Thank you.
This is the last episode of 2020, which is crazy. I have had an absolute blast this year talking to the most interesting people. And I'm so grateful that all of you listeners have been tuning in week after week after week. So thank you. We are going to be back on the 6th of January with a very exciting episode. In fact, we've got loads of exciting episodes lined up for the start of the new year. As you heard earlier, we've got Jeff Spooner coming on from the making of Harry Potter, which I'm really excited about. I definitely fangirled a little bit on that podcast. We have Holcombe Estates coming on to talk about their sustainability plans. And we have the brilliant National Football Museum, who are coming on to talk about why your attraction should have a podcast. So stay tuned. We'll see you in the new year. But in the meantime, have an absolutely wonderful Christmas and festive break. Thanks for listening to Skip the Queue. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find us. And remember to follow us on Twitter for your chance to win the books that have been mentioned. Skip the Queue is brought to you by Rubber Cheese, a digital agency that builds remarkable systems and websites for attractions that helps them increase their visitor numbers. You can find show notes and transcriptions from this episode and more over on our website, rubbercheese.com/podcast.